April 15th, 1945. Thuringia, Germany. 3 days after George S. Patton walked through Ohrdruf concentration camp and saw a kind of war that did not end when the shooting stopped. 3 days after he saw bodies stacked in a shed. 3 days after he stepped away from the others and was sick behind a building, because even a man who had lived inside war for years still had a limit. Now he was standing in the hallway of a converted German schoolhouse, holding half of an SS identity disc in his gloved hand. The other half was in the next room, and the dying man who owned it wanted Patton to do one thing before he died: not forgive him, not save him, not even comfort him. He wanted Patton to write one word beside his name: soldier. That was the word. And that was the problem. Because the man in the bed was not wearing the uniform of an ordinary army. He was wearing the runes of the SS, and Patton had just walked through what that uniform had helped build. The request reached him through an orderly who spoke enough English to be useful, and enough German to know the translation was dangerous. The wounded prisoner was a Waffen-SS lieutenant named Matthias Kroll, 23 years old, abdominal wound, no surgery left that could help him. He was conscious, calm, and close enough to death that everyone in the room had stopped pretending there was still a medical question to answer. The doctor on duty, Captain Henry Alden, had already done everything medicine could do: morphine, pressure dressings, warm blankets, water on the lips. The rest was time. But Kroll had asked for a final statement, and Alden did not know whether he had the right to give it. He had treated German prisoners all week. That part was simple. A wound was a wound. Blood was blood. But this was not a wound. This was a verdict. So Alden found Patton in the American ward. Patton was sitting on the edge of a cot beside a tanker from Pennsylvania, whose left arm ended in a white bundle of gauze. The boy was trying to joke about it. Patton was not laughing, but he was smiling in a way that made the boy keep talking. That was what people who only knew the legend missed. The legend had polished pistols and thunder in his voice. The man in the hospital wards had a habit of lowering himself onto a cot as if rank had been checked at the door. He asked names. He asked towns. He asked what a man had planned before war interrupted him, and when a soldier answered, Patton listened as if the answer might be entered into the official history of the world. Alden waited until Patton stood. Then he stepped close and said there was a German in the other room asking for the general. Patton's face did not change. Alden explained the uniform, the wound, the request, the half-identity disc, the word. Patton looked down the corridor toward the canvas partition that separated the German beds from the American beds. For several seconds he said nothing. Outside, a truck engine coughed twice and died. Then Patton asked one question. What did he do? Not what is he wearing. Not what did his organization do. Not what do we want to believe about men like him now that Germany is collapsing. What did he do? Alden had no answer. There had been no time to search records, no interrogation, no witness list. Only a dying prisoner and a collar tab that answered too much and not enough. Patton closed his fingers around the broken metal disc and walked toward the partition. The German room had 4 beds. One held a Wehrmacht corporal with a fractured skull, breathing through his mouth. One held a Volkssturm boy of 16 whose uniform jacket was too large at the shoulders, and whose eyes had not moved from the ceiling since morning. One bed was empty. The last bed stood by the window. Matthias Kroll lay there under a gray army blanket, face pale, hair dark with sweat, the black SS collar tab still visible where the bandage had not covered it. Late afternoon light came through the dirty glass and made the room look warmer than it was. The room smelled of carbolic acid, wet wool, old wood, and the sour truth beneath all field hospitals. Patton entered. Kroll turned his head. He saw the stars. He saw the helmet. He saw the ivory-handled revolvers. Every soldier in Europe knew those revolvers. Something moved over his face. Not fear, exactly. Not relief. More like recognition that the final authority he had asked for had actually come into the room. Patton pulled the chair beside the cot and sat down. He did not stand over the man. He did not make him look up. He sat close enough that neither of them could hide behind rank. In German, rough but clear, Patton said he understood. There was something Kroll wanted said. Kroll swallowed. His breathing was thin and uneven. The doctor stepped forward, but Patton lifted one hand slightly, and Alden stopped. Kroll wanted to spend his own breath, so the room let him. He said he had fought at Kharkov, then in Normandy, then across the retreat into Germany. He said he had never served in a camp. He said he had never guarded prisoners. He said he had worn a soldier's uniform and taken a soldier's wounds and would die as a soldier if someone with authority had the courage to say so. His voice broke on the last part, but not from emotion, from pain. He turned his eyes toward the identity disc in Patton's hand. The disc had been broken the way German tags were broken when a man died. One half stayed with the body. One half traveled with the paperwork. Kroll said his mother would get no grave, no body, maybe not even a notice. So he wanted the half disc sent to her with the word soldier beside his name. Not SS, not criminal. Soldier, there it was. Not a request for life. Life had already left the room and was waiting in the hallway. Not a request for innocence. Even Kroll seemed to understand that innocence had become too large a word for anyone in that uniform to hold easily. He was asking for classification, for one final label that might survive him. Alden stood near the foot of the bed. The orderly stood near the wall. The 16-year-old in the corner finally turned his head. Patton held the half-disc between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it as if the small piece of metal weighed more than it should have. Then he looked back at Kroll. I was at Ohrdruf 3 days ago. The room changed. No one moved. But the air in the room changed. Kroll's eyes shifted once, just once, toward the window. That was enough. Patton did not describe the camp. He did not list the bodies. He did not say what the shed smelled like or what the lime had failed to hide. He did not tell Kroll about the civilians ordered through the gates so they could never claim the luxury of not knowing. He did not need to. By April of 1945, Germany was out of hiding places. The camps had not been known equally by everyone. That lie would always be complicated enough to give cowards room. But they were not unknown, not to men in SS uniforms, not entirely. Patton said, the men who built that place also used words. Honor, duty, service, order, soldier. He said every one of them had been made to carry things it should never have carried. Then he held up the disc. This metal does not become clean because you are dying. Kroll closed his eyes. For a moment, the only sound was the wounded corporal breathing. Patton leaned forward slightly. His voice was not loud. That made it worse. I cannot write the word you want in the way you want it written. Kroll opened his eyes again. Patton continued. I will not tell your mother you were a camp guard if I do not know that. I will not tell her you were a murderer if I do not know that. But I will not call that uniform ordinary. Not after what I saw. Not to comfort you. Not to comfort anyone. The orderly translated in a whisper, sentence by sentence. When he finished, Kroll stared at Patton. The answer had landed exactly where it was aimed. It had refused him, but it had not dismissed him, and that made it harder to answer. Kroll's mouth moved. At first, nothing came out. Then he said, "Then there is nothing." Patton shook his head. "No, there is still the truth." That was the kind of sentence Patton could say because he had spent his whole life speaking as if the truth had physical shape. A map, a bridge, a road, a flank, a body in a hospital bed. He believed in facts the way other men believed in shelter, and he believed in God as if God were not an idea but a superior officer with a direct line to the field. That mattered in that room, because Patton was not deciding whether Matthias Kroll had a soul. He did not believe he had the authority to decide that. He was deciding what a general could honestly put on paper without borrowing authority from God or surrendering it to hatred. He asked Kroll, "Were you at any camp?" Kroll said no. "Did you shoot prisoners?" Kroll said no. "Did you see it done?" A longer silence. That silence did not belong to morphine. It belonged to memory. Kroll said, he had seen men taken behind a barn near Zhytomyr. He had been 21. He had not fired. He had not stopped it. He had told himself the men were partisans. He had told himself it was not his order. He had told himself many things. By the end of the war, he said, the telling had become harder. Patton listened without interrupting. The orderly translated with less and less certainty, as if each sentence left mud on his hands. Kroll said, "My mother thinks I was brave." Then he turned his face away. "Maybe that is what I wanted you to protect." That was the first honest sentence in the room that did not arrive dressed as an argument. Patton let it sit there. Then he said, "A mother does not need lies to grieve her son." Kroll looked back. Patton placed the half-identity disc on the blanket, close to Kroll's hand. "She needs to know where he died. She needs to know he was not abandoned. She needs to know he asked for her when there was nothing left to ask for." Kroll's face changed, not softened, not redeemed, changed, as if he had come asking for a title and discovered too late that the title was not the only thing that could survive him. He whispered his mother's name. Elise Kroll, a street in Augsburg, a younger sister named Marta. A father missing since the winter fighting near Vitebsk. The details came out slowly. Alden found a pencil. The orderly found a torn invoice from the schoolmaster's desk. Patton did not use the invoice. He asked for proper paper. When none could be found, he took 2 clean sheets from his own dispatch folder. The general who could move armies across France sat beside a dying SS lieutenant and confirmed the spelling of a woman's street address, letter by letter. Kroll tried to laugh once when Patton mispronounced Augsburg. It became a cough. Alden leaned in, but Kroll waved him away. Patton waited until the coughing stopped. Then he wrote. He wrote in English because English gave him the exact pressure he needed. The letter would have to be translated later. That did not matter. He was not writing for speed. He was writing for truth. He wrote that her son Matthias had been wounded in the fighting in central Germany. He wrote that American doctors had treated him. He wrote that he remained conscious for part of his final hours. He wrote that he had asked that his family be told. He wrote that this request in any man should be honored. He wrote that her son was not alone when death came near. He did not write that Matthias Kroll had been innocent. He did not write that the SS was misunderstood. He did not write the word Kroll had asked him to write. He wrote around the lie without touching it, and somehow the letter became more merciful because of that. Kroll watched his hand move, a 3-star American general, writing to a German mother in a captured schoolhouse, while the war outside was still dying loudly in the distance. There are moments in war so small that no official history has room for them, and so large that the men who witness them carry them longer than battles. This was one of them. Patton folded the paper once, then again. He wrote the address on the outside. He placed the broken identity disc inside the fold, not as proof of innocence, not as honor, simply as proof that the son had been real. He handed the packet to his aide, Lieutenant Willis Grant, who had arrived at the doorway sometime during the writing and had the good sense to say nothing. "See that it travels," Patton said. Grant nodded. He understood the tone. That was not a request. Patton stayed in the chair. Kroll's breathing had grown shallow. The 16-year-old in the corner had closed his eyes, though whether from fatigue or from the wish not to watch, no one could tell. Alden checked the bandage. There was nothing to check. The body had begun making its final decisions. Kroll said something too low for the orderly to hear. Patton leaned closer. Kroll repeated it. "Will she hate me?" This was the question beneath the other question. Not soldier, not SS, not court, or history, or God. A mother, a son. And the terrible possibility that the woman who remembered him as a boy might one day learn enough to turn away from him, even in memory. Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "That is not mine to answer." Kroll's eyes closed. Patton added, "But I have never known mothers to be simple in their grief. That was all. No absolution, no sermon, no lie dressed as kindness." Kroll's breathing continued for several minutes. At one point his hand moved toward the blanket where the disc had been, then stopped because the disc was gone and because there was no strength left to search for it. Patton took off one glove and laid his bare hand on the edge of the bed. Not on Kroll's chest, not in a gesture anyone could mistake for blessing. Just there, visible, human, present. When Kroll died, it was 6:43 in the evening by Alden's watch. Alden wrote the medical words: hemorrhagic shock, penetrating abdominal wound, prisoner of war, Waffen-SS, 23. Patton stood only after the doctor finished. He put his glove back on. He looked once at the body. Then he walked out. In the corridor, Lieutenant Grant fell in beside him, still holding the folded letter. They passed the American ward, where the tanker from Pennsylvania had finally stopped joking and fallen asleep. They passed a chalkboard where German children had written arithmetic problems before the building became a hospital. They stepped outside into evening. The air smelled of damp stone, gasoline, and spring earth disturbed by too many vehicles. No one spoke in the car back to headquarters. Grant later wrote that the silence was not anger. It was not grief in the usual sense. It felt, he said, like riding beside a man who had chosen to carry something because putting it down would have made him lighter in the wrong way. That is the part of Patton people still misunderstand. He was not gentle by temperament. He was not cautious. He was not built for soft moral language. He believed war required violence and speed and a willingness to break the enemy before the enemy recovered his balance. He believed hesitation killed men. His army's advance across Europe proved how far that belief could carry steel, fuel, and exhausted human bodies. But Patton also believed that command did not give a man permission to stop seeing those bodies. That was the contradiction he lived inside. He could order an attack in the morning and visit the hospital in the afternoon. He could praise aggression to officers and sit beside a private who had lost both feet and ask him about the girl waiting back home. He could believe the destruction of Nazi Germany was necessary and still refuse to make destruction cleaner in his mind than it was in the ward. Most commanders survive by distance, not because they are cowards, because distance is useful. Distance turns men into figures on a chart, tons of fuel, miles gained, casualties sustained, enemy resistance reduced. Those words are necessary. No army can function without them, but those words can become a drug. Taken long enough, they make a man capable of moving numbers without feeling the weight of the human beings inside them. Patton distrusted that relief. He used the numbers. Then he went looking for the men inside them. That was why the hospital wards mattered. Not because they made him softer, because they kept him from becoming abstract. Ohrdruf had made the danger of abstraction visible in a way no lecture could. The SS had perfected a system in which human beings disappeared into categories: prisoner, labor unit, transport, quota, disposal. The language itself had become a weapon. It allowed men to do monstrous things while feeling administratively clean. Patton had seen the end of that language in the shed near Gotha. He had smelled where it led. So when Matthias Kroll asked for the word soldier, Patton knew the danger. Words were not decoration. Words were records. Words could rescue truth or bury it. He would not use a clean word to cover an unclean uniform, but he would also not use the uniform to excuse unnecessary cruelty. That was the narrow bridge he walked. He refused the lie. He wrote the letter. Both were the same act. That is what made the room hard to understand for people who prefer morality to arrive in single pieces. The easy version would have made Patton a sentimental victor who forgave a dying enemy and rose above hatred. That did not happen. The other easy version would have made him a righteous avenger who denied the man every scrap of tenderness because the uniform had earned none. That did not happen either. What happened was harder. He kept the judgment, and he kept the man. He held them both at once. The SS collar tab meant what it meant. The mother in Augsburg had done nothing. The dying lieutenant could not be allowed to rename the organization he had chosen. The dying lieutenant also did not need to vanish from the world, as if leaving him unrecorded would repair 1 inch of what the SS had done. Patton knew the difference between justice and appetite. Justice required truth. Appetite wanted the enemy to disappear completely. After Ohrdruf, no one would have blamed him for appetite. That was exactly why refusing it mattered. Lieutenant Grant delivered the letter into the military mail stream 2 days later. It moved slowly. Everything moved slowly in Germany that spring unless it was a tank, a rumor, or a disease. Rail lines were broken, offices had collapsed, civilian addresses had become guesses, names were misspelled, translated, copied, lost, recovered, delayed. The letter reached Augsburg months after Germany surrendered. By then the war was officially over, but for families it was still arriving one envelope at a time. Elise Kroll received the folded paper from a local office clerk who did not know what it meant. The clerk had seen hundreds of notices: missing, dead, unknown, transferred, no information. This one was different. It had an American signature at the bottom and a broken half of an identity disc wrapped inside it. Elise read the translation first, then the English original, although she could not understand every word. She understood enough. Wounded, treated, asked for family, not alone. She did not receive the word her son had wanted. She received something more durable than a word chosen in fear. She received a witness. She kept the letter in a prayer book for the rest of her life. Not because it proved her son was clean. It did not. Not because it cleared the uniform. Nothing could. She kept it because somebody who owed her nothing had refused to let her son disappear into the silence of a ruined country. That fact did not answer every question. It did not remove guilt. It did not restore the dead from Ohrdruf. It did not make Matthias Kroll something other than what he had chosen to join. But grief does not always survive on answers. Sometimes it survives on one verified sentence. He was not alone. Patton never mentioned the letter in public. There was no reason to. Public Patton belonged to maps, speeches, reporters, armored columns, arguments about occupation policy, and the long shadow of his own temperament. Private Patton belonged partly to hospital rooms. Men who watched him there wrote about a different kind of discipline. Not softness. Discipline. The discipline to sit where command had consequences. The discipline to look at a stump, a burn, an empty sleeve, a boy too young for his uniform, and not let the mind turn away. The discipline to understand that necessary decisions still leave marks on real bodies. By the summer of 1945, the fighting had ended. But the wards were still full. That is one of the cruel truths victory hides. The flags rise before the hospitals empty. The guns stop before the amputations do. The treaties begin while men are still learning how to button a shirt with one hand. Patton kept visiting. American beds, sometimes German beds. Not as policy, not as theater, as accounting. He had won the kind of victory generals are born wanting. And afterward he had to live among the receipts. There is a story from that summer of him speaking to a German tank crewman with burns across his face. The man had been a school teacher before the war. He feared his daughter would scream when she saw him. Patton reportedly told him the face was not where his daughter knew him. Maybe the line was remembered imperfectly. Maybe the room changed it in memory. But the shape of it fits the pattern. Patton did not know how to make war less terrible after the fact. He only knew how to keep refusing the extra cruelties that served no purpose. That is what the schoolhouse letter was. Not forgiveness, not politics, not reconciliation. A refusal of extra cruelty. A smaller thing. And, in that room, the only thing left. December came fast. Patton was injured in a vehicle accident near Mannheim and paralyzed from the neck down. The man who had crossed Europe through motion found himself trapped inside stillness. He died in Heidelberg on December 21st, 1945. Before he died, a chaplain read to him from the 23rd Psalm because Patton could not hold the Bible himself. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He had walked through that valley in tanks, in staff cars, in hospital wards, through the gates of Ohrdruf, and into a small German room where a dying SS lieutenant tried to borrow the word soldier before the end. Patton would not give it to him. That is important. He did not soften the uniform. He did not clean the record. He did not let a deathbed request overrule what he had seen with his own eyes. But he also did not leave. That is more important. He stayed long enough to learn the mother's name. He stayed long enough to write the address. He stayed long enough to make sure the letter carried the only truth he could honestly send. Not absolution. Not condemnation beyond evidence. Not a clean word for an unclean history. Just the sentence a mother could survive. He was not alone. Sometimes the hardest mercy is not giving a dying man the lie he asks for. Sometimes it is staying after you refuse. Sometimes it is writing the letter anyway. Patton did not give Matthias Kroll absolution. He gave his mother a witness.